And I almost want to say, well, screw all that stuff. Forget all that stuff. Forget all that stuff about altering the target number. I'm only interested in the stuff that modifies the effect. Why don't I just roll and get my effect and then I get a better one? Why don't I just do that instead of worrying about all that arithmetic about my target number? Because that will only affect my modifying the target number a little bit either way. That only changes my effect a little bit. But if I get that other kind of modifier, which allows me to really change my effect a lot, well, why don't I just do that? That's way better. That's what we were talking about with D&D. It's way better to have extra damage than it is to have an improved chance of success.
Yeah.
So
I guess,
and for the same reason, really. So how many people here are familiar with Burning Wheel? Playing it at all? Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me if I'm summarizing this correctly. Similar to Shadowrun and Vampire, or the White Wolf games, you roll a bunch of dice, and only some of them will be called successes. And so that's your base value, right? Some value. You roll a bunch of dice, you're never going to get, or rarely going to get, all successes. You'll get some successes. Typically, it'll average out at half the number of dice. Okay, so far so good. But you have an opponent doing the same thing, I believe, or there's an obstacle. If the obstacle is a person, then they've rolled as well. Okay, right?
Yeah.
And whether it's a set obstacle or it's something that they've rolled, it's going to whatever successes they get, subtract from your number of successes. So first of all, your dice have been effectively cut in half in terms of successes. And then whatever they did reduces it more. So the effect in all those games, Shadowrun, any White Wolf game, Burning Wheel, is that you typically fail or succeed by a very small margin. So far, so good? So what you're really looking for are traits or talents or powers or skills or something. You're looking for those things which automatically give you a boost in effect, no matter what you roll. That's your gold. That's the thing that will get you through that game. You see what I'm saying?
I completely agree.
And so that principle is a big design principle, which is in a lot of games. But all of those games, that's an immense amount of mathematical effort to go through in order just to end up with your tiny margins either way. It's very labor intensive.
Yeah.
So those are some of my concerns about that. But what I'm driving at is that if we look at how am I going to put it? In all of those games, what you've got is a bell in your hand and a bell in the opponent's hand, right? Bell curves in each case, multiple dice, right? And with a strong average, to discover. And that's the same whether you're cutting them in half, success or failure, like you do in Burning Wheel. It's the same in those other two games, although it's not exactly a half, right? The value on the dice can shift. And then it's also, it would also be the same, although you don't do this in any of the games, it would also be the same if you just added up the dice, right? I mean, the same statistics occur. If you just added it up and got a value, the same statistics occur. The curve is the same. So
you're probably going to get a bit of a numeric difference because it doesn't really matter if you get 4 or 5 when you compare successes.
Right.
While maybe.
Right. I understand. But
it doesn't change.
But the basics of success or failure, is set by the number of dice and the target number. So then, but you have 2 of them, and the successes of one cancels out the other. If you draw this on a graph and take both rolls into account, you get a sinusoid, an S shape, right? And so it's it's really just mathematically 2 bells multiplied, right? And so it's an S. So what you see, what I'm trying to get at is that in anything that I've said about the Champions GURPS fantasy trip method, which is rolling 3 dice 6, adding it up, and getting that value or less. Anything I said about that applies to all of these systems. All of them are really just 3 dice 6 with bells and whistles. That's all. And the fact that you have 2 opposing rolls only means that the effects are narrowed and are kept from being wildly swingy. So basically, having the 2 opposed rolls just makes a higher and tighter bell. Or rather, sorry, a lower and tighter bell, not higher. A lower and tighter bell. Less values, less effect, and a much closer distribution. So so therefore, anything I've said about the 3 dice 6 system and the ways you affect either the target value or your position on the curve, right? And then the effect of rolling. Anything I've said about that is the same for these somewhat what look like different systems. Who would say that GURPS and Shadowrun have the same system? But in terms of their actual mathematics and the actual things that modify it and the things you look for as modifiers, they are the same. So that's kind of what I'm driving at, at the moment. So that leaves me with the Legendary Lives table. What is it? Do I keep that and continue to play with it in playtesting as I sort of provide my own setting and a whole different set of character options? I'm seeking to preserve the kind of crazy or fun, whimsical qualities of Legendary Lives, but I kind of want to make it less like Rollmaster and more like Marvel Superheroes. Right? I mean, I could just give it up as a bad job. It's not a bad job, but I should, for those purposes, I give it up and just port Marvel Superheroes into it, simplify the whole damn thing. Right? Do I do that? Or do I say, okay, I can use a sound mathematical principle to make that table? Do I just simply make that table less symmetrical? Do I put a curve into it, right, along the green line? We take the green line alone, and I simply make the Legendary Lives green line look the same. Oh, and then I would have to alter. What I would do is I'd have to tip the others, right? I have to tip the others so that they weren't just symmetrical to the corners. And then it would look more like Marvel Superheroes. Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah, that does. But I guess the question I have is, looking at the Marvel Superheroes one, if we say what is the most important result on here, it's not the green.
Right.
Green is fine, but it becomes yellow. Yellow is your most important.
Yeah, I agree.
Sweet spot.
Now, Legendary Lives is nice about this because if you get the green result in Legendary Lives, to get a real result, to really get what you want, you're forced to roll something else and succeed. So that makes a lot of sense. I think I see what you're saying, and I was simply chiming in because Legendary Lives has a similar effect in that you don't really just want the passable. Passable carries obligations and annoyances that the better results don't. What you want is the next level up, really. So if we look at the shape of that, alter its shape. So there's three, I think, categories between passable and awesome. So if you, three or four. So if we change the shape of that block so that it looks like the one in Marvel Superheroes, then I think everything that I have kind of going on in my head about this, at least that's what I'm thinking of doing. That's how I'm thinking of messing with it. Which maybe is a really long way to go to just say, well, I'll just imitate that. Right? I mean, I could say, well, this works experientially, so I'm just going to imitate it. You could, but I kind of wanted to get a better idea of sharing the dialogue about this. Because I'm used to thinking about doing all my curvature with the mechanics. Look at all my games. Look at all my games, and you will find that the randomizing mechanics are deeply curved in one fashion or another. You know, we have sequential rolls like in Troll Babe. We have, you know, these dice pools like in Sorcerer or Elves, I think, or at least a multiple die roll in Elves. We've got, you know, big old dice pools in Mutual Decision. We've got accumulating dice, right, with a total and certain comparative values, matched values in Slay With Me. You've got a 2d6 system in Circle of Hands. There's, I mean, I love all my games show some form of intrinsic curvature in the randomizing mechanic, and they also, in one fashion or another, involve a lot of resource, a lot of consequential resource that's either getting hammered really hard or spent for really big effects or something like that. So for me, taking a flat resolution and then saying, now how do I make that good? I'm not intuitive at that. So you guys are pretty much just, you know, you're helping me talk through it. I'm really glad you brought up Rollmaster. Just another example, like Feng Shui for the 2d6. In Zero, you roll 2d6 and you multiply them. And then there's an interesting thing where, depending on what you're using, you're trying to roll under or over. So for some of your skills, you're trying to roll under. For some of your skills, you're trying to roll over. And since it booms up fast, right, by multiplication, those values leap up really fast. So therefore, your attention to your weaker skills, the ones where you're trying to roll under, is actually really important in that game. So it's a really interesting system for that. But if you look at the distribution of values, even though objectively, I mean, or rather literally, their numbers go up in a curve, right? But their distribution, it can't be anything more than your plain old D2, D6 bell. The distribution is the 2d6 bell. It just is. It has to be. So you really are rolling a 2d6 method, and what the multiplication does is it creates your table of effects. That's different. But the distribution of the values is still the same craps curve, 2d6 added together gives you that little hump, and that's what it looks like. So again, you can have systems that look and feel very different, But you have to be careful. Sometimes they really are just the same distribution. And then you have to see if they're doing something else. Like with 0, with the over and under, that starts to matter a lot. But if 0 had just your standard incremental success, right? Rolling higher is better, for example, or rolling under is better, doesn't matter which one. If it just had those incremental levels of success, then multiplying is a completely meaningless exercise. It has no role. It just sets the scale of effects and nothing else. So if 0 didn't have that over versus under skill method, that multiplication would be trivial and unnecessary. So this is just a good example of how you have to look at weird, separate parts of the system and see how they go together for it to be any good.